Hey everybody, this video is called The Crime of Gibeah, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Judges, where we're going to look at the crime of Gibeah. So we're in the 19th chapter tonight, and in verse 1 it says, "And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah." So one thing that we must realize as we're looking at the chapter here today is that we see that the priests could marry, and we see that back in Leviticus chapter 21 verse 7 and Leviticus 21 verse 13 and 14. It's not like what you see with Catholicism today, where the priests cannot marry. However, what we also see is that concubines, or what some people refer to as slave wives, was not acceptable to God, as God has already defined his will for marriage to be between one man and one woman. And obviously we know that from Genesis 2:24. And concubines was culturally legal in the acts of men, and that's one of the ways that mankind thwarts God's given guidance. You know, mankind, they call that stuff back then good, just like today they call homosexuality good, even though God is against it. And no king in Israel meant that Israel did not acknowledge God as king. And a concubine is essentially also, some might find it easier to think of a concubine as a mistress. And it was very common practice that it was wrapped up with a lot of very important people and names that you find here in the Old Testament, like King David and Saul and Caleb, Jacob, Abraham, King Solomon, and Rehoboam. And what you will also find when you study the word concubines in the Old Testament is that God never blessed when people partook in those kind of relationships, nor did he ever permit it or endorse it. But verse 2 through 4, it says, "But his concubine played the harlot against him, and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her, to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. So they ate and they drank and lodged there." So the harlot should have been killed as required by the law, and could have been if there was a devotion to holiness and obedience to Scripture, as it was called for back in Leviticus chapter 20 verse 10. And a priest wasn't allowed to marry a harlot, as Leviticus 21 verse 14 stated. So his ministry was greatly tainted, and yet he made little of her sin and separation, and he sought her back sympathetically. And we see, though, that the Levite husband went on to seek reconciliation with her, and her father, we see, is happy, and he's either happy to see them reconcile, or he's happy for her to leave the house again. In verse 5 through 10, it says, "Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, 'Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way.' So they sat down, and the 2 of them ate and drank together. Then the young woman's father said to the man, 'Please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry.' And the man stood to depart. His father-in-law urged him. So he lodged there again. Then he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, 'Please refresh yourself, your heart.' So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And then the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant. His father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, Look, the day is now drawn toward evening. Please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here, that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early, so that you may get home. So we see here that the Levite intends to leave on the fourth day, but he's persuaded by his concubine's father to stay put one more night. And Jebus was an early title for Jerusalem because of the Jebusite control, as we saw back on Independence Day when we opened our study of Judges in Judges chapter 1 verse 21. And that went on until David wrestled it away to become his captain in 2 Samuel 5 verse 6 and 9, which we'll be looking at the end of the year. And you may remember the early name for the city of Jerusalem being Salem. If you remember from Genesis 14, Jerusalem was referred to as Salem in Genesis 14:18, and then also you can find that in Psalm 76 verse 2. And here was an example of the kind of personal immorality that went on during this era. In verse 11 through 15 says, They were near Gibeah, and the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, Come, please, and let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and lodge in it. But his master said to him, We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel. We will go on to Gibeah. So he said to his servant, Come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah. Then they passed and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go into the lodge of Gibeah, and when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into the house to spend the night. So Jerusalem was still partially out of control of the Israelites, and Gibeah was under Israelite control. It was a safer place for the Israelites, or so they thought. And the Levite and his concubine, they found no hospitality, we see, in Gibeah. Among their very own people, they did not get hospitality, even though hospitality among the people of God was commanded back in Leviticus 19, verse 33 through 34, and Leviticus 25:35. So the people, they failed to extend the courtesy of lodging, which opened the door to immorality. In verse 16 through 21 says, Just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjaminites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, Where are you going, and where do you come from? So he said to him, We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah. Now I am going to the house of the Lord. But there is no one who will take me into the house. Although we both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant, there is no lack of anything. And the old man said, Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square. So he brought them into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet, ate and drank. So we see that the only person that goes on to show hospitality to the Levite and his concubine was a man from their very own region, and none of the native people of Gibeah cared for the strangers in their midst. And he was headed for Shiloh to return to priestly duty, as the last chapter told us, and that's where the house of the Lord was at. And the old man knew of the danger of the open square at night for them. And we see that out of all the people, an old man takes care of them. And verse 22 says, "And as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, 'Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him carnally.'" So verse 22, it's very, very disturbing verse. "And the perverted men were the sons of Belial, who were the worthless men who desired to commit sodomy against the Levite." And the phrase elsewhere was used for the idolaters back in Deuteronomy 13:13, and the neglectors of the poor back in Deuteronomy 15:9, and for the drunks as well, as we're going to see in the next few weeks when we move to our fall season study in 1 Samuel 1:16. We see immoral people after that in 1 Samuel 2:12, and the rebels of civil authority in 2 Samuel 20 verse 1 and Proverbs 19 verse 28. And Belial can be traced to the false god Baal, and that's also a term that is used for yoke. They cast off the yoke of decency, and in turn for entangling or murmuring. And their request was the same made by the homosexuals who surrounded the house of Lot in Sodom back in Genesis 19 verse 5. And during this time of Judges, we see that Israel, the people of Israel, are just as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah was back in Genesis 19. In verse 23 through 26 says, "But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, 'No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now, humble them, and do with them as you please. But to this man do not do such a vile thing.' But the men would not heed him, so the man took his concubine and brought her out to them, and they knew and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light." So verse 23 through 26, not just the perverted men of Gibeah were clearly guilty, the Levite and the host of the home was as well. And the master of the house was willing to sacrifice his own daughter, and the Levite cared nothing for his concubine. And, so we see an unfortunate case of what you could probably call gang rape and murder were the pitiful sequel. And this is unthinkable weakness and cowardice from any man, especially a man that is claimed to be a priest of God. And apparently, we see that he slept through the night, or he stayed in bed out of fear, since he didn't see her again until he awakened and prepared to leave. And centuries later, Israel is reminded of the crime at Gibeah, and it's used as an example of wickedness in Hosea 9:9 and Hosea 10:9. So this whole crime at Gibeah isn't going to be out of Israel's hair. They're going to be reminded of it centuries down the road. And so today's chapter, we wrap up looking at where the Levite takes on the concubine. We talked about what a concubine is and all that. And we see one of the 4 times in this book where it says that there was no king in Israel. And we discussed about concubines and how it was not endorsed by God in the Old Testament. And Old Testament men were wrapped up into it, and even high Old Testament men like King David and King Solomon and Abraham, and all those names that we discussed earlier. But I want to look at Matthew chapter 19, verse 4 through 6. And it says, "And he answered and said to them, Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." So Jesus clarified God's definition and the guidelines that God gave for biblical marriage. And we see that the Levite is also reconciled with his concubine after she committed adultery. And, to talk about Jesus is defending what the Old Testament says in Genesis 2:24. Oftentimes we hear from unbelievers or liberal Christians that they identify as, whatever they call themselves, they'll be like, oh, Jesus never spoke against homosexuality. Jesus was loving and tolerant, and Jesus told people to do what they want, so on and so forth. But in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus quotes from the scripture to stand on what is the definition and the morality of marriage. And it's a common unbiblical teaching as well that all adultery matters are justifiable for divorce. We hear that very often, that, the Bible permits divorce for unfaithfulness and all that. And so I want to read verse 7 and 8 here. It says, as Jesus continued speaking, "They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" You see, verse 7, that is what the Israelites, this is what the Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus with. So, the same thing, Moses commanded, or, God commanded that if she's unfaithful, that there needs to be a divorce. But verse 8 says, "He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so." So Jesus says in verse 8 that it was permissible when there is unfaithfulness, adultery, because of the hardened hearts. It wasn't because God said so. And it's never commanded for a divorce. And you will not see a command for a divorce at all in the whole Bible. You see permission. And marriage should always be made with every effort to survive and succeed, for better times or worse, till death do you part. And we saw that the father of the concubine, he extended the visit with his daughter with a traditionally generous show of hospitality. And we saw that upon returning home, that the Levite and the concubine decided to spend the night in Gibeah with their own people. And we saw that there was a lack of hospitality of God's people there. And I want to look at Matthew 25, verse 35. Many people know this verse. Matthew 25:35 says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in." So throughout the scriptures, and even in the epistle or the book of Romans, we see hospitality as part of God's plan for our ministry. And have you ever been to a church that has lacked hospitality? Maybe you were in the military where you were stationed in multiple places, and you had to go church, I call it church hunting at times, but maybe you had to go try out new churches for a body while you're in that assignment to be where you're at. So have you ever visited a church that lacked hospitality? And I brought up the military because I was in the military back 2010 through 2015, and I was stationed at two different duty stations in Hawaii and Washington State. And Hawaii worked out great because Hawaii, we went to our church, Ohana Baptist, and that was the first time me and my wife actually were going to church together, because if you know us, we were two different pathways. I was Pentecostal, she was Baptist. But we leave Hawaii and go to Washington State 2014. And this is where we went, church searching, whatever you want to call it, to see, if there's a body that we could belong to. And so we try out this one church. I won't name the name because it's actually a good church. It was a rough patch, and it was not where we needed to be. But it was in Washington State, and we arrived. We have two young children, and we go up the stairs. We park in the visitor parking, obviously, because they had visitor spots. It kind of gives away when you're a visitor if you're parking in the visitor spot. Nobody said a word to us as we were going in. We walk in. It's not like a mega building, but it's a larger building. And they didn't have any clear signage or anything, so we'd look for the Sunday school class and all that. And, it was a little search trying to, navigate. Whereas, most churches, when you go somewhere and they recognize you as a first-time guest, usually you have a greeter that will greet you, maybe offer to bring you to show you around, something on so forth like that. But we weren't greeted up until, I think, on our way out of that service. But then, we went to another church that was very friendly in the atmosphere, Lakewood Baptist Temple in Lakewood, Washington. That was a good time that we had there for a very short period before I left the Army. But, hospitality, we need to be showing hospitality as Christians when we go, or when people, come to our local bodies and everything. But in today's chapter, we see that there was someone that stands up, and it was an Ephraimite that found them and extended hospitality. And this wasn't just a young Ephraimite or, a extrovert. This is an old man, and he took recognition and he gave them, what they needed. And we see the gruesome crime of Gibeah and what the perverted people demanded. It was kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah 2.0. And we see their wickedness and their perversion. And, I was mentioning sons of Belial earlier, and you might not know, you should know, that in 2 Corinthians 6:15, it refers to Satan as Belial, and that's really what is happening. The things of this world is under the God of this world. Things that go against God are under the God of this world, who we know is Satan. And we see the ending of the chapter where the Levites discover his dead concubine, and he issues a call for national judgment. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next time, as we're going to look at Israel's war with Benjamin, in Gibeah. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. God bless.